class, and today we're joined by Professor Peter Phillips of the Department of Sociology. He's also the former director of Project Censure, which is one of the great news sources in America and the world, and one of the different perspectives on the news. And he will be talking with us today about the U.S. NATO global empire in service to the transnational capitalist class and the circumstances of the Ukraine. So please welcome him to the street time.
Thank you very much. In 1795, a meeting at the Pelican Inn in Swineham, England, a number of local magistrates devised a system to alleviate the distress caused by high grain prices. This was a period when the Napoleonic Wars were going on, and the prices of grain were very steep. The authorities at Swineham approved a mean-tested sliding scale of wage supplements in order to mitigate the worst effects of poverty. Essentially, families were paid extra to bring income up to a level to prevent starvation. Payments varied according to the number of children and the price of bread. Swineham laws were established to prevent declining productivity in the workforce. So instead of setting wages at a level adequate for living, low wages were supplemented by the state to a level high enough to prevent starvation and to protect employers' profits. Recently in Canton, Ohio, a Walmart store decided to have a food drive for needy families on the holidays. What made this such a tragic PR mistake was the needy families were mostly Walmart employees working in the store. Walmart low wages had led to full-time employees seeking public assistance. In fact, Walmart workers received $2.6 billion in government help each year, including health insurance. That works out to about $5,800 per worker, or about $420,000 per store. In Wisconsin, it was even higher because state benefits were higher, and Walmart stores there received $900,000 per year in government subsidies. So Swineham is alive and well in the United States today. We supplement workers so that employers can pay them low wages. Walmart has 2.2 million employees. At 1.2 million in the U.S. alone, gross revenues of $475 billion, profits in the $17 to $20 billion range, and it dominates the domestic retail space with 66% market share. It's so huge that 100 million shoppers patronize their stores every week. They have twice as many employees as the U.S. Postal Service, the world's largest fleet of trucks. Americans spend $36 million per hour at the stores. They sell more food than any other company in the world. And the average American family spends about $4,000 a year there. They have 10,400 stores in 27 countries worldwide. If Walmart was an independent country, it would be the 25th largest economy in the world. Now, among the richest people in the world, number 8, number 12, number 13, and 14 are Waltons. Jim, Robson, Alice, and Christie, each worth between $34 and $37 billion for a family net worth of $140 billion. So some of the richest people in the world are being subsidized by governments in order to protect profits and keep wages low. many that think there's really something wrong with this system. But this is a type of news story that the corporate media will rarely cover. Corporate media is not interested in reporting what the powerful and rich are doing and decisions made in their name. But we have to ask the question, why does the corporate media fail to cover and investigate important news stories that reflect inequalities of class, race, gender, corruption, or massive human misery? Why are the airwaves filled with junk food news stories and celebrity tales, mindless trivia, while over 30,000 people a day die in the world for malnutrition and easily curable diseases? That's 10 9/11s every day in the world. Why does the U.S. NATO empire deploy occupying troops, private mercenaries, and special kill teams in over 130 countries worldwide? Why is the president killing humans, including American citizens, without trial or due process with predator drones flown from remote locations all over the world? Up in Beale Air Force Base in Northern California, an officer can go leave his home in the suburbs in the morning, leave his family and children, drive to the base, fly a predator drone in Afghanistan, kill people, and then drive home for dinner. That's the level of distance and sophistication that we've involved in war and mass murder. The media doesn't cover these things. Why does the media not cover election fraud in the United States? George W. Bush was never elected to the presidency. Both the elections of 2000 and 2004 were manipulated, fraudulent, via voting machines or registration purges. There have been books written on this, full analysis. It's never been talked about in the corporate media. So to answer these kinds of questions, to look at these contradictions in society and the world, we have to take a look at the controlling interests within the U.S. NATO military empire in the world. Now, Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky, in their book Manufacturing Consent, published 25 years ago, claim that because media is fully embedded in the market system, it reflects the class values and concerns of its owners and advertisers. According to Herman and Chomsky, the media maintains a corporate class bias through 5 systematic filter systems: concentrated private ownership, a strict bottom line profit orientation, over-reliance on government and corporate sources for news, a tendency to avoid offending the powerful, and an almost religious worship of the market economy, and strongly opposing any alternative beliefs in governments that are socialist or communal. These filters that will become news and society set the parameters of acceptable coverage of daily events in our world. But the consolidation, this was 25 years ago, but the consolidation of media today and the expansion of public relation firms who work for government and corporations has resulted in a far more deliberate form of censorship. The corporate media is deeply interlocked with the military-industrial complex and the global dominance policy elites in the world. The media is increasingly dependent on various governmental and corporate sources of news. Corporate media has and maintenance of continuous news shows requires a constant feed, an ever-entertaining supply of stimulating events, breaking news bites. The 24-hour news shows, MSNBC, Fox, CNN, have constant contact with the White House, the Pentagon, and various public relations firms representing both government and corporations. This is top-down news. Simply put, censorship is more than blatant outright admission. We face what appears to be a military industrial media empire so powerful and complex that truth is almost absent or reported in disconnected segments with little historical context. For several years, we've been describing the impact of censorship as a truth emergency in the U.S. and the world. Among the most important censored news stories of the past decade has to be that over 1 million people died because of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. This, of course, does not include the numbers of deaths from the first Gulf War or the ensuing sanctions against the country, combined close to another million deaths. So there were at least 2 million Iraqis that died because of our involvement in that country. Beginning in March of 2002, over 1 million people died violently, primarily from U.S. bombings and neighborhood patrols. These were deaths in excess of the normal civilian death rate before under Saddam Hussein. Among U.S. military elites, the issue of counting the dead was dismissed before the invasion even began. In an interview with reporters in March of 2002, the war on terror, was General Tommy Franks said, "We don't do body counts." In January 2008, the British polling group Opinion Research Business reported the survey work confirms our earlier estimates that over 1 million Iraqi citizens have died as a result of the conflict. ORB interviewed 2,400 randomly selected families in 15 of the 18 provinces in Iraq, asking the question, has anyone in your family died from war violence? The data resulted in a report that stated we now estimate the death toll between 2003, actual invasion time, and August 2007 is in excess of 1,030,000 people. This report came on the heels of 2 earlier studies conducted by Johns Hopkins University and published in the Lancet Medical Journal, which is one of the most prestigious journals in the world, confirming the continuing numbers of mass deaths in Iraq. A study done by Les Roberts in January 1 of 2002 to 2003 put the civilian deaths at 100,000. A second study published by Lancet in October of 2006 documented at that time that there had been 650,000 people dead. The 2006 study confirmed that U.S. aerial bombings in civilian neighborhoods caused over a third of these deaths, and over half of the deaths were directly attributed to U.S. forces. So the magnitudes of these million-plus deaths is undeniable. These are just the people who died. Millions more have been wounded both physically and mentally. Over 5 million have been displaced from their homes. The occupation by U.S. force guaranteed a monthly mass death of thousands of people. A carnage so severe and so concentrated as to equate it with the most horrendous mass killings in world history. More tons of bombs were dropped on Iraq than in all of World War II combined. And this carnage has continued with ongoing sectarian violence inside Iraq after the U.S. withdrawal, and now the U.S. is again bombing in Iraq. Since 1945, the United States has militarily intervened in over 80 countries, and the death toll is multiple millions of people, mostly civilians. Wars today, 80–90% of the people dying are civilians. Now, the American ruling class has long been determined to be self-perpetuating, maintaining its influence through policy institutions such as the National Manufacturers Association, the National Chamber of Commerce, the Business Council, the Business Roundtable, the Conference Boards. These are all elite planning organizations. The American Enterprise Institute, the Council of Foreign Relations, the Heritage Foundation, the Hoover Institute, and various other corporate-centered policy groups set the agenda, set the what we need in the country sort of decisions. C. Wright Mills, in his book, The Power Elite, stated that the power elite comprised of corporate, military, and government elites in a centralized power structure motivated by class interests and working in unison through higher circles of contact and agreement. He wrote that in 1956. Just before Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex and the power of it. That's 50 years ago. Estimates today are that the world's total wealth is around $200 trillion, with the U.S. and Europe holding approximately 63%. An adult requires around $600,000 to be a member of the top 1% of the world. Some of you may have families that have a house that's worth more than that. But the top 1% is really compared to the top 100th of 1%, the top 1,000th of 1%, are quite a distance there. Of the top 1% of the wealthiest people in the world have hidden away between 20 and $30 trillion in secret tax-exempt bank accounts spread all over the world. The money's there. It's just controlled and hidden. Capitalist power elites exist around the world. The globalization of trade and capital brings the world elites into increasingly interconnected relationships, to a point that sociologists are beginning to theorize the development of a transnational capitalist class. It's not just a power elite in our country, American upper class. We're talking transnational corporate folks. Foremost among the early works of the idea of an interconnected transnational corporate class within global capitalism was Leslie Sklar's book in 2001, The Transnational Capitalist Class. Very good book, a good one to start with. Sklar believed that globalization was moving transnational corporations into broader international roles, whereby corporation states of origin became less important than the international agreements developed through the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and other international institutions. Emerging from these multinational corporations was a transnational capitalist class whose loyalty and interests, while still rooted in the corporations, were increasingly international in scope. Maybe that's why Burger King decided to move to Canada. Deeper inside the transnational corporate class is what David Rothkopf calls the superclass. David Rothkopf was the former managing director of Kissinger Associates, Henry Kissinger's consulting group. He was also former Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade. He published his book, The Superclass, The Global Elites and the World They Are Making, in 2008. According to Rothkopf, the superclass constitutes about 1,000th of 1%, which is about 6,000 to 7,000 people. It's a very small number of people, given we have 6 to 7 billion now. These are the Davos attending, Gulfstream private jet flying, money-encrusted, mega corporation interlocked policy planning elites of the world. The people at the absolute power of the global power structure, absolute peak of the global power structure. They're 94% male, predominantly white, mostly from North America and Europe. And Rothschild reports that these are the people that set the agendas at the G8, the G20, NATO, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. Now last year, in our annual Project Censored book, last year was 2014, it's the one that's currently in the market now, 15 will be out in 2 months. We did a study, it was a year-long study on the people on the boards of directors of the top 10 asset management firms, people who invest money, and the top most centralized corporations in the world. With overlaps, you take the top biggest money management and the top most connected corporations and you put those 20 names together, you end up with only 13. Most of them are banks. Barclays Bank, Great Britain, #1. BlackRock Inc. out of New York, investment group. Capital companies, FMR, Fidelity Worldwide Investment. Read the Wall Street Journal or study this. These aren't household names necessarily. AXA Group, State Street Corporation out of Chicago, JP Morgan and the Legal and General Group, PLC, Vanguard Group, USB, AG, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Credit Suisse, Alliance, PEMCO. Now these are the 13 biggest, most interconnected, most wealthy firms in the world. On their board of directors is a total of 161 people. They could fit in this room. These are the financial core of the world's transnational capitalist class. Collectively, these 161 people manage $24 trillion of funds that affect every country in the world. The institutional arrangements with the money management system of global capital relentlessly seek ways to achieve maximum return on investment. The structural conditions for manipulations, legal or not, are always open. The LIBOR scandal, where they were manipulating the exchange rates between various currencies, shaving off a million here, a million there, have been exposed. But these institutions become too big to fail. Their scope and interconnections pressure government regulators to shy away from criminal investigations and much less prosecutions. The result is a semi-protected class of people with increasingly vast amounts of money seeking unlimited growth and returns with little concern for consequences of their economic pursuits on people, societies, cultures, and environments. 136 of these 161 core members are male, 84%. 88% are whites of European descent, Americans or Europeans. 52 of them hold graduate degrees, 14 JD, 21 PhDs, all attended private college, or very prestigious colleges. We look at the 161 people, 25 of them went to Harvard, 11 to Oxford, 8 to Stanford, 8 to Columbia, Cambridge, Chicago, Cologne, Columbia, Cornell, Wharton School of Business in Pennsylvania, UC Berkeley. 49 were CEOs before they were in the management groups of these companies. Many had prior experience with Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, Swiss Reinsurance, Barclays, Merrill Lynch. People from 22 nations make up this financial core of the transnational corporate class. 73 or 45% are from the U.S. 16% are from Britain. 14 from France. 12 are Germans. 11 from Switzerland. 4 from Singapore. 3 each from Austria, Belgium, India. 2 from Australia, South Africa. 1 from Brazil. Vietnam, Hong Kong, Qatar, the Netherlands, Zambia, Taiwan, Kuwait, Mexico, and Colombia. Carlos Slim is one of the richest people in the world. He used to be number 1, with Bill Gates beat him last year, and we're passing him a little bit. He's from Mexico, and his son sits on a BlackRock board. Members of these financial courts, and we looked up the biographies of all 661 of these people. And they're available. You can look at their bios online under projectcensor.org and type in transnational corporate class. You'll see the studies under our research studies. So we have a pretty extensive bio of what we could find on each of these individuals. They all take part in an active part in global policy groups or government advisory positions. 5 of the 13 corporations have directors on the International Monetary Fund. 6 of the 13 have people who have worked at or served as advisors to the World Bank. 5 of the 13 firms hold corporate membership in the Council of Foreign Relations in the U.S. 7 of the firms sent 19 of their directors to attend the World Economic Forum in February of 2013. 7 of the directors served on Federal Reserve boards. Several are in the Business Roundtable in the U.S. So these are people who have direct experience with the financial ministries of countries all over the world, financial ministry of the European Union countries and the G20. Almost all of these 161 individuals served in some capacity for various regulatory organizations, finance ministries, universities, or national and international policy planning groups. The people that could fit in this room are serving on the largest planning organizations and decision-making bodies in the world. Now the U.S., Western governments, and the U.S. and international policy bodies serve the interests of this financial core of the transnational corporate class. They serve the interests of capital. Wars are initiated to protect their interests. International treaties and policy agreements are arranged to promote their success. Power elites serve to promote the free flow of global capital for investment anywhere that returns are possible. So the U.S. NATO military empire, with now over 800 to 1,000 bases worldwide, is in service to transnational corporate capital's global domination agenda. Capital seeks to dominate and control capital worldwide, all capital. In an unrelenting quest for capital growth, the empire seeks nothing less than full neoliberal economic control of the world's resources and the full subjugation of human labor. To say anything less ignores 500 years of the history of capitalism, which resulted in world wars, enslavements, and the death of millions, and a continuing state of permanent war against any resistance by states or people. The current crisis in Ukraine is but one step in the unrelenting consolidation and control of transnational capital. The global circulation of capital is at the core of an international bourgeoisie. They operate in monopolistic clusters around the world. These clusters of elites form strategic transnational alliances through mergers and acquisitions with the goal of increased concentration of wealth and capital. The process creates a polyarchy of hegemonic elites. The concentration of wealth and power at this level tends to overaccumulate, leading to speculative investments, economic crisis, and global and regional wars. So if we drop more tonnage of bombs on Iraq than we did during World War II, we buy those bombs again from companies that make them to replace the supply. War is profitable. The transnational corporate class makes efforts to correct and protect its interests through global organizations like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, G20, the World Forum, Economic Forum, Trilateral Commission, Bilderberger Group, Bank for International Settlements, and other various transnational organizations. These transnational institutions are in service to the transnational corporate class and rely on U.S. NATO military hegemony for the enforcement of global agreements and support of global governments favorable to the TCC agenda of expanding and concentrating global capital. The U.S. NATO is the strongest military in the world. They are the police force. They're the ones operating in 130 countries. If there's resistance, which we will identify as terrorists, if the government doesn't cooperate, they go into action. Governments unsupported, the transnational capitalist interests are pressured to comply, or they are undermined in a quest for government or regime change. Inside the governments of the U.S. and NATO allies are various intelligence agencies who operate from within a deep state that remains outside the public realm. We don't know what the CIA does, or NSA, for the most part, or MI5, or the various other intelligence agencies. Within this system, nation states become little more than population containment zones, and the real power lies within the decision makers who control global capital and encourage the implementation of overt or covert action to maintain and expand their domination. The world's corporate media, which is in turn owned and controlled by the transnational corporate class, pays absolutely no attention to academic concepts like transnational capitalist class. We did a LexisNexis search of news coverage recently using the term transnational capitalist class. We got 3 hits, 2 from foreign media and 1 from a letter that Leslie Sklar had written to a newspaper. The concept of a transnational capitalist class is absent from corporate news coverage and absent from most people's understanding of what's going on in the world. The corporate media in the U.S. NATO empire covers foreign unrest issues in various countries as if they are silos. Got one over here, you got one over there, you got a government problem here, and a resistance group there. Countries in war or crisis are treated as isolated cases where nation-state decision makers and various opposition groups and parties create tensions that could result in civil unrest and regime change. Then during these periods of internal chaos, human rights violations often occur, where the corporate media identifies the supposed perpetrators of violence as evil Hitler-like regimes, deserving of ongoing unrest and needing to be sanctioned by the international community. If human rights violations are serious, humanitarian military intervention is demanded by the peace-loving people in the world. That's the way the media will present it. However, the U.S. NATO deep state intelligence agencies engage in systematic undermining of regimes targeted for change to governments more acceptable to international capital. It was ongoing. Practices of how the U.S. NATO empire conducts deep state efforts for regime change in various countries are becoming more sociologically observable. If we review the histories of the U.S. NATO deep state activities, evident in what has happened over the past 2 decades, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, Yugoslavia, El Salvador, Libya, Syria, and the Ukraine, we begin to see similar practices that demonstrate the unrelenting surge of transnational corporate power inside the U.S. NATO military empire. While in some of these cases regime change has not yet been successful, such as in Venezuela, each case has been ideologically justified by a war on terror or humanitarian intervention, so that we can observe these patterns. There are actually patterns. You can see this in Ukraine, you can see it in Syria, you can see it in Algeria. Long-term external funding of opposition parties takes place. Special projects, democracy building, covert operations, assassinations, counterintelligence activities, bribing of officials, infiltration of regime bureaucracies are all part of covert and overt manipulations meant to undermine target governments for regime change. This is ongoing. Sometimes it'll take years at it. The U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and the National Endowment for Democracy are often working in cooperation with domestic and foreign intelligence agencies, private corporations, non-governmental organizations, and U.S. ambassadors in the CIA in these countries. These efforts include the organization of opposition leaders ready for assumption of government authority at the correct time. All the above associated with continuing public relations effort by PR firms in service of transnational corporate class and the U.S. NATO empire, and cooperative corporate media inside a managed news system. So if there's unrest somewhere, PR firms are putting out stories about Assad or Gaddafi or various other leaders around the world. Step 2. Funds are provided to opposition groups to organize public events, mass rallies and marches, demonstrations against the regime. When we say funds, we talk about hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. In the Ukraine, American officials have bragged they spent over $5 billion to have that government overthrown. Support of false flag operations, such as the use of sarin gas in Syria, sniper shootings in Libya, Ukraine, and Venezuela are blamed on the targeted regime. Transnational corporate class media puts the blame on deaths on the police and the military of the regime. So we were almost ready to bomb Syria a year ago. From pages of the papers across the country, Syria, Assad uses sarin gas on his own people. Like Saddam Hussein using gas on the Kurds, which we have no proof that he did. And there certainly wasn't any proof that Assad used gas. And we were really close to bombing, to humanitarian intervention, we call it. No fly zones for Assad. And bringing in warplanes. It turned out that the sarin gas that was used came from another source. The delivery systems were not something Assad had. But Assad agreed to eliminate all of his sarin gas from his country under pressure from the UN and NATO. The beneficiary of that was Israel. Israel and Syria have been at odds. Israel has occupied the Golan Heights, which was part of Syria for many, many decades now. And Syria had built up a large supply of sarin gas in order to counter Israel's nuclear weapons. So there was you use those, we'll use ours kind of thing. Those are now gone. So there's no deterrent left to Israel in terms of Syria's capabilities. They agreed to eliminate them so we wouldn't bomb them. It's tactical, it was planned, that's how they wanted it to happen, but I think we were quite ready to go ahead and bomb and push that government out. Step number 3. Incidences are undertaken to create violent incidences whereby innocent victims are injured or killed. Support of false flag operations such as sarin gas, shootings in Libya, Ukraine. When I was in Caracas, they took me to an area where just outside the presidential palace. They said, that hotel over there, the top of that, that's where the snipers were that fired on the people who were marching in opposition to the government. But it wasn't their people. They were mercenaries hired from outside. Those sorts of things are easy to happen. 75 years ago yesterday, World War II started. Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st. In order to justify the invasion, he dressed up German troops in Polish uniforms and attacked another part of his forces. And he claimed Poland had attacked Germany and they therefore invaded the country. So false flag operations are not uncommon. So there's an acceleration of funding of parties, a funding of events, mass marches, rallies. People are injured, and the government is demonized in the world press. And that's when the U.S. NATO empire begins demanding humanitarian intervention. And they combine that with economic and trade sanctions, cutting off the regime's access to international banking and credit. The phase includes UN resolutions, proposed military activities by NATO. This is all everything that they did to Gaddafi. U.S. International Monetary Fund, World Bank sanctions, and indictments of specific individuals by the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court can indict anybody in the world as long as they're not in America and Europe. So we wouldn't allow that to happen, our government. So finally, either the regime collapses or a violent military coup takes place, which has happened in Ukraine, removing non-cooperating officials and opposition forces take command of the government. Or the U.S. NATO empire forces infiltrate and initiate military action, such as no-fly zones, bombings, invasions, or occupations. Libya, Ukraine, the gold deposits were liberated to U.S. NATO control from those countries. While these patterns of intervention are mostly readily observable from the history of the past 2 decades, various elements of these patterns have a long history inside the U.S., NATO, and allies' desire for concentration of capital over the past century. Now, such practices require continued ideological justification. In U.S. history, it was manifest destiny, democracy building, fighting the global communist conspiracy, war on terror, and each have in turn have a cultural narrative, an ideological justification for capital expansion and economic control of various regions of the people. Certainly the U.S., the idea of manifest destiny and American exceptionalism allowed the suffocation of an entire continent of native people and the Mexican territories. Bringing democracy to the people was an ideological justification for the U.S. invasions and occupations of Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines a century ago, and many nations since. The ideology of fighting the global communist conspiracy after World War II justified U.S. and Allied engagements in Korea, Southeast Asia, and various other nations, including Guatemala, Iraq, and Iran. The ideological divide opened power struggle after World War II between communism and capitalism supposedly ended with the collapse of the USSR. However, the 5-century agenda of global capital domination never ended and has continued to be present under the guise of a war on terror and humanitarian interventions. However, the ideological justification for a U.S. NATO empire intervention in Ukraine does not fit in the context of a war on terror or humanitarian intervention. The U.S. NATO capitalist challenge to Russia is clearly more evident in the case of Ukraine. So it appears that starting in 2013, we were seeing the return of ideological rhetoric of Cold War nuclear warfare re-emerging. The transnational corporate class media, without noting the hypocrisy, disseminated criticism of Russia's imperial aggression by U.S. officials themselves responsible for imperial aggression. In March of 2014, the writer and President George W. Bush Iraq invasion speeches, David Frum, tweeted, "If Russia allows acts the outlaw nation, it can be expected to be treated as anything but an outlaw." John Kerry claimed, "We just don't invade another country or on phony contacts in order to assert our interests." However, when Kerry was a senator from Massachusetts, he voted for the Iraq invasion in 2003. When asked about the similarity of Russia's invasion of the Crimea and the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Obama said, well, at least America sought to work it out with the international system. So the 2013-14 news coverage of the Ukraine and Syria vis-a-vis Russia and the U.S. NATO empire illuminates the reemergence of the existence of the Cold War and an anti-Russian frame. Transnational corporate class media sees nothing more than evil leaders in Iran and Syria who are committing human violations, and the president of Russia has encouraged these evildoers as a co-partner in their crimes. The bear has rearisen. Regarding the Ukraine, transnational corporate class media are setting a Cold War frame of international tension, brinksmanship, similar situations in the early Cold War in Berlin, Vietnam, and Cuba. This is ongoing. The U.S. NATO allies are accelerating the crisis with tension-filled statements, military threats, while at the same time expanding military capabilities and bases and a tightening ring of containment around Russia and, of course, China. So Poland, all the countries on the Baltic, all part of NATO, weapons are being brought in, right on the Russian border. This brinksmanship appearing in Ukraine must be understood as inevitable in the context of 500 history of capital expansion and the unrelenting deep state manipulations by U.S. NATO intelligence agencies in service to and in cooperation with the transnational corporate class. Key multinational corporations had to benefit from new resources, access, and war spending, and will often be included in the planning and implementation of covert operations. Understanding the theory of deep state power, observing similar patterns of behavior is now more readily available to us to study empire. So the war on terror was simply not sustainable as a long-term justification for global power concentration. Ukraine underscores the idea that a larger frame, similar to the US-USSR, is reemerging to justify further interventions. Our understanding the need for a new Cold War media frame helps a lot in recognizing the continuing efforts by the US NATO empire to bring total neoliberal capital control over the entire world. Also seems Understanding the patterns of deep state politics will become increasingly easier to observe capital concentrations globally. Transnational corporate class is becoming more transparent, as the 99% recognize the power and need for continued growth and consolidation by the 1,000th of the 1%. By watching and calling out the lies of the transnational corporate class, U.S. NATO empire, we can support our own democratic institutions. We can encourage leaders elsewhere to recognize the patterns of power and take steps to resist. Front page of all our papers this past week: Russia invades Ukraine. A convoy of 180 trucks drove into the resistance sectors of the Ukraine as part of an invasion force. That's the way it got played, Washington Post, all the papers, you saw that on television. Those trucks unloaded their medical supplies and their food, and they turned around and left. There was no invasion force. The pictures of tanks you saw that were identified as Russian tanks were tanks captured from the Ukrainians by the resistance forces in those regions. Not one Russian soldier, boot on the ground, has gone into Ukraine. They didn't invade the Crimea. They already had forces there. The people in Crimea voted 90% to secede from Ukraine and join Russia. There was no invasion. So that misinformation is prevalent through corporate media here in the U.S. and the world, and a justification for us to accelerate, to spend money to reinforce literally fascist parties inside the Ukraine today, with various military aids and agreements. The American people and others around the world are faced with a serious moral dilemma. Murder and war crimes are being conducted in our name. Yet most Americans have no idea the magnitude of the deaths and tend to believe the U.S. intervenes for humanitarian and democratic purposes. Knowing that the U.S. NATO empire is in reality interferes globally to protect capital expansion, and the transnational corporate class is a vital understanding for we the people, the 99%. Consumers of corporate television in the U.S., especially those whose primary understanding comes from that medium alone, while part of a 99%, they're embedded in a sea of junk food news and disinformation. The result, to varying degrees, is populations living in a state of excited delirium, meaning that the news is exciting, it's scary, it's the latest terrible car wreck, or the forest burning up, or the late movie star scandal, or the most gruesome murders. But people are living in an excited delirium of knowinglessness. We don't know what's going on. And corporate media is not telling us. To counter knowinglessness, we must build truth from the bottom up. Critical thinking, courses like this, fact-finding are a basis of democracy. We must stand for the maximization of informed, participatory democracy at the lowest possible levels in our society. We must continue to openly discuss, research, and validate our issues. We must see ourselves as an important component of building a new, non-exploited world based on freedom of information, democracy, and human rights. We face a global empire of corporate military power that's unrelenting and propagandizing the subjects with fear and disinformation. It falls to us to take a stand on truth and transparency by encouraging independent media research regarding manipulations of the powerful. We have a public education role and responsibility for both training critical thinkers in society and expanding public knowledge and awareness of inconvenient truths. A commonality of purpose can help guide us in these endeavors. The principles espoused by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights offer a fundamental foundation of values that social institutions, political organizations, churches, colleges, universities, high schools, grammar schools, and families can openly share. It's up to us to retain a belief in the Enlightenment and early free thought movement. We are the organizations that can offer hope for people to unite and oppose common oppressors manifested in altruistic and unresponsive governments. Only when the public forms and controls its own information resources will it become armed with the power that knowledge gives to create a new and truly vibrant democratic society and promises as well delivers liberty, peace, and prosperity to all. Corporate media lies to us. They're getting better at it. It's not just a privacy issue, it's a cognitive liberty issue. Freedom of thought or cognitive liberty is a natural human right for each person to be secure in the abilities to preserve the world to the best for their capabilities. To have true cognitive liberty in a world as complex as ours means that we must have access to truthful and unbiased information about the actions of the others and the general state of the world. The Center for Cognitive Liberty defines this as the right of each individual to think independently, autonomously, and to use the full spectrum of his or her mind and to engage in the multiple modes of thought. In the 1960s, we called that power of the people. Thank you. Sure. Should I call myself?
Peter Phillips always gives us a rousing lecture. It gets you stimulated, thinking about things that you haven't thought about. And I really invite you to give some questions or ask about definitions or terms or anything that's on your mind. Questions?
Well, I think I mentioned Algeria once, and I meant Libya, but that was a mistake on my part. Sometimes when I do this, I misspeak. But, and there may be some others that you caught. Yes?
Tell me a little bit more about Project Censored.
Project Censored, it was founded here at Sonoma State 38 years ago. It's a media research group now affiliated with some 30 universities worldwide. I'm pretty much the contact here on campus, but I was director for 14 years, but I'm no longer director for the past 5. We have a nonprofit corporation that operates off campus, which raises money for our website, projectcensored.org. And so we have archives of news stories, many of which I mentioned today, but certainly a lot of the study that I mentioned is on that site. It's a very massive resource for independent news and news stories from all over. You're doing term paper on literally any subject. You can go inside that website and search for your terms and likely find something that you didn't find elsewhere. So it's currently there's 50 to 60 faculty members involved in from various campuses and 200 to 300 students. We make a annual list of the most important news stories that corporate media didn't cover. This is one of our tasks. We also have a weekly radio show on KPFA on Friday afternoons at 1 o'clock, which airs in 16 stations nationwide, and I'm one of the hosts, and Nikki Huff is the other.
I think you guys have a link to that on the alternate media resources for the part of your assignments. I think that would all the different syllabuses, I think that's that. We need to look at that particular biography, so you did the 161 and make sure that it's going to get something.
Yeah, that's available online. And plus, yeah, in fact, the full biography on each of the individuals is only available online. It was too much to put in our book. Other comments? Well, it's a lot to take in. Yeah, David.
So, if students are interested in finding independent sources of news, could you highlight a few?
Well, if you go to our website and you click on independent source of news, you're going to get 25 independent sources that with daily feeds. So whatever news they're featuring today will be up there. One of my favorites is Russia Today. They're funded by the parliament in Russia, but they're completely independent from Putin and probably are one of the more accurate daily news sites in the world. We can now get a telesur from South America in English, which is online, which is pretty good. Other sources that I really like are Nutrition Science Monitor is usually pretty good. But I really try to stay away from MSNBC and Fox and CNN. It's just not, I could, every day I read a newspaper and I see stories left out or stories that are only half there or misinformation. There was one, I think it was a story on the TV today. It said, U.S. air bombing saves Iraq. Yeah,
It's in the Wall Street Journal.
yeah, but it was it was on the front page of the TV. And U.S. airstrikes liberate Iraq. Oh God. So that's, yeah. So I think there are a lot of good sources out there, and they're not that hard to find online. So they're hard to find on television. RT's on television. Free Speech TV is pretty good for the news part. Amy Goodman, Democracy Now! Is a good news show every day, available on multiple sites and on the radio. I just found that she's on KBBF, which is a local station here, 89.1. She's on at 10 o'clock. And but she's on every morning at KBFA out of Berkeley, which you can get up here as well. Yes?
How do you feel about Al Jazeera in terms of bias?
Well, Al Jazeera, during the beginning of the Iraq War, was very critical of the U.S. involvement. They showed what was happening to people on the ground. We tended to show cruise missiles and bombs taking off. They showed what happened when they hit. About 3-4 years ago, Qatar government kind of clamped down on them under U.S. pressure, and some of their coverage is not as critical as it used to be. So they got compromised a bit. They're still a fairly good news source, but I do favor Russia Today over them. Yes?
Okay, so towards the beginning you were talking about the president.
Speak up a little bit, Katie.
Towards the beginning you were saying how the president has drones killing innocent people in the U.S.
Yes.
Elaborate a little bit,
I mean the world, not U.S. citizens are killed.
Oh, okay.
We're not using drones to fly around and kill people in the U.S. yet.
Okay, so you don't.
But police departments can buy drones, and part of the militarization of police departments has been to do that. Does that answer your question?
Well, do you know if there's in California and how we know where they are, if that's possible?
Are there drones in California? Yes, there are. There are drones with Forest Service, a variety of other places. Police departments are beginning to look at using drones. They in fact could arm drones, and that would be the next step probably in militarization of police departments. But because of Ferguson, it's getting a lot of attention of the militarization process, the 1033 program, and what's going on in police departments around the country that now have tanks and automatic weapons and various militarized equipment, which is government surplus that they can't. So we have this nice tank here in Santa Rosa Sheriff's Office has, and in fact they use it to bash down a door. When they were trying to catch some guy who was hiding in his attic and had killed himself last summer. Yes?
If the media functions as a fourth branch of government,
Could you speak louder? I'm sorry.
would you agree that the media functions as sort of a fourth branch of government?
Yes.
And because of that, does it downplay or non-coverage of like critical contemporary issues of today? Like,
Yes.
is that basically, is that hindering any progress that will ever be made, or?
Not ever. We can make our own progress. She asked if the U.S. corporate media was acting like a fourth aspect of the government, and I essentially said yes, they are. I mean, it's State Department news, and even AP is essentially Associated Press, which is the largest distribution of news organization in the world. It's most of their sources are government sources or public relations firms. But stories are created for public interest. Remember saving Jessica Lynch? The beginning of the Iraq War, this young blonde private who was captured by the wounded and captured by the Iraqis and went in to save her. That was a fabricated story. Yes, she was captured, but the hospital called up the Americans and said, come and get her, you can pick her up in an ambulance, she's fine, we're taking care of her, come get her. Instead, the PR firm Renton Group had to use that to create an incident whereby they had the special troops going in to rescue her, and it was a big front page on Time magazine all over the country, rescue of Jessica Lynch. They did that as a diversion story the same day that we invaded Baghdad and bombed Al Jazeera and killed one of their journalists there. And shot and shelled a hotel where a lot of the journalists were. So, but in here, we got the saver Jessica Lynch, the rest of the world knew what we were doing. I'm sorry. Was there more to your question?
Yeah, but I'm still kind of formulating.
Yeah, think about it. And no, corporate media is embedded with the power elite. There's no other way to say it. And are they independent? There's some good journalists out there that try to be. But the minute they start to get too critical or they take on stories that are severely, critical, like try to say that the 2004 election was fraudulent, which it absolutely was. There were 8 million votes different from the exit polls than the voting machines. And exit polls are 99% accurate. And so that Bush never won an election. And those capabilities are still there. But everybody who ends up being the president candidate for presidency has been really vetted by the power elite in this country. Yes?
Just to give equal time, I think it also could be said that during the Obama election, there was a lot of press given to the Black Panther movement. That was in polling places in Philadelphia, expressing votes. There was a little bit of coverage, but a lot of it was suppressed. Can you speak to that?
I'm not sure what you're referencing. You're talking about Obama's minister in Chicago?
So there was a thing brought up that people were turned away from polling places in Philadelphia by Black Panthers. So I mean, it was not wildly covered.
I never saw it. You think like it would have been wildly covered if that was true, but I don't know. I never saw it.
It's available.
Okay.
That's good.
You check it out, then I'm easy to find. Peter.Phillips, that's Normon.edu. If you find it, send it to me. I'll take a look.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if you guys are sitting here, is it hard, you just take for granted, or is it hard for you to take, I think the big picture argument here is that 161 people, let's use that number, either have so much control or at least pretend to have that much control, whether it be the media or the transnational corporations. How does that argument rest with you right at this moment? We'll talk about that discussion first, but if you have any questions or just, I don't agree there. Do you agree with that? Does that make sense to you? Or is this your worldview?
It's not a matter of agreement. I mean, it's just what it is.
Well, I'm saying, I don't know if they necessarily heard that argument necessarily in their lives.
I had a hand here first and then there.
So, question on that topic, you talked about a lot of things, the corporate media and so forth and all that. I didn't really catch the transnational capitalist class going back to those 168 how many people were super wealthy people being involved. So, is there actual evidence that they're directly involved in the media and the world events? Or is that more?
Well, that gets into deep state theory, which is Peter Dale Scott out of Berkeley is the one who really did come out alive with several books on it. What he's saying is the intelligence agencies inside of these governments operate undercover, out of sight, and are continually trying to manipulate and do that. They have PR firms that will put out news stories and try to manipulate the media. They will in fact create stories that are their own. That are just fabricated stories. They will absolutely lie to us. Do the 161 individuals sit in a room like this and say, you will do this and you will? No. They just set policies at these international meetings, and those policies are implemented. If it's time to get rid of Gaddafi, and it was in Libya from their perspective, because he was starting to say the African countries should charge for African oil, the U.S. should have to pay in gold. And that didn't go over well. The same thing, Saddam Hussein was the first person to start selling oil in euros instead of the dollar. So these are big policy issue kinds of things that most people don't realize are at play inside of these organizations. So it's not a star chamber, somebody saying do this, do that. Hand over here.
I was going to say, like, what you said is probably true, but there's a way to live your life to, like, be knowledgeable of what's happening and to understand it as opposed to getting see what what's going on. Because I think if you think much try to get crazy, then that's like if you think about, like, the mass media and all that stuff, that's how people go insane. Just like going through the depth in it. I think you can understand it, appreciate what's original, what's real. You know, without getting too in depth in it, but
Well, you're sounding a little bit like you don't want to know. But that's, I mean, I think people do want to know what the powerful are doing to ourselves.
knowing something manipulating or like you can be knowledgeable what's happening, it's just not like going too far into it.
I don't have any problem with fully understanding what the powerful are doing. If it's affecting my life, I'd really like to know. If they're killing people in my name, I'd like to know that too. Whether or not we can do anything about it is a whole nother ballgame. That gets into social movements and like Occupy movement scared the hell out of me. They infiltrated every Occupy movement in this country. They demonized them. They said there's no leadership. And they ignored them in the press. And still Occupy groups engaging. There are several right here in this county engaging and ongoing. But what Occupy left us with was this 99 versus 1% mantra that we understand and everybody understands now. So I'm just elaborating on that. I think it's really important. When we start talking about 1%, we talk about who they are. And it isn't just the 1%, it's the 1,000th of 1%.
Hey, did you have a comment? Another speaker, did you have a question?
One hand in the back, is that it, or we're gonna go?
What do you think about the ISIS movement? Is that actually just another attempt at making another bankers war over in Iraq and Syria, or do you think it's an actual movement that has been caused because of America going there?
The ISIS leadership was trained by the U.S. in Jordan 2 years ago. They were trained to engage in Syria. That movement has expanded, and the Shababi, the Sunni movement, is behind it, that partly is funded from different countries. We created that situation that allows a vacuum of power inside of Iraq. They just basically moved into areas where there wasn't any resistance. Now the fact that we're bombing them again means that we're probably going to bomb them in Syria as well, which is on the table. And that means that we're bombing in Syria, might as well just bomb everybody we don't like. I hate to say that, but that's what's happening. All right, well, thank you very much.